Harlem, 1930. The air was thick with tension, the streets humming with the pulse of a restless city. It was the kind of place where power was earned, not given, where loyalty meant everything and betrayal could cost you your life. Bumpy Johnson stood at the heart of it all, the kind of man who didn't ask for respect but commanded it. He was known by everyone, feared by many, but only a few truly understood the weight of his influence. Tonight, however, was different. The NYPD had crossed a line they didn't realize they'd even crossed. But Bumpy, ever vigilant, knew exactly what was happening. The game was changing, and he wasn't going to let them rewrite the rules without a fight. The city had always been his playground. He controlled the streets, the hustle, the flow of power. But there were those who tried to rise above him, to challenge his throne, to make deals with the wrong people. The police were part of that network, crooked, corrupt, playing both sides to line their pockets. But tonight, the game was about to shift. As Bumpy walked out of his office, his sharp eyes scanned the dim-lit street corner. The usual players were on their corners, exchanging glances and making moves, but there was an unfamiliar tension tonight. The cops had gotten bold, too bold. Word had spread that a raid was planned, a raid that was supposed to break his grip on Harlem, but they had underestimated one thing. Bumpy Johnson didn't lose control. A black sedan pulled up beside him, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. The door opened, and there he was, Lieutenant O'Hara, the face of the corruption that ran through the NYPD like a vein. O'Hara was the kind of cop who played dirty, making money off everyone from politicians to petty criminals. But his recent power grab was a step too far. He thought he could take Bumpy down, thought he could break the legend. O'Hara stepped out, his coat flapping against the wind. He had the look of a man who thought he had already won, the kind of man who thought Bumpy was just another cog in his machine. The lieutenant approached with a smirk, but the look in Bumpy's eyes told a different story, one of rage held back by pure control. "Johnson," O'Hara sneered, lighting a cigarette, "you think you own this neighborhood? I run this city and your time is up." Bumpy didn't flinch. He stood still, as calm as the eye of a storm. The smoke from O'Hara's cigarette twisted in the air between them like a snake, but Bumpy's gaze was steady, unwavering. "You make a mistake coming here, Lieutenant." Bumpy's voice was low but packed with a threat so tangible that even the cold night seemed to retreat from it. The street grew still. Harlem, for all its chaos, seemed to hold its breath. The next few moments would decide if Bumpy Johnson was about to lose everything or if he would remind the NYPD who was really in charge. O'Hara took a slow drag from his cigarette and exhaled, eyes narrowing. "You're nothing but a small-time thug, Johnson. You think you can keep getting away with it? With everything? We have you now." His words hung in the air, but Bumpy's response was swift. Without a single wasted movement, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. Just an ordinary piece of paper, but to O'Hara, it felt like a death sentence. "You want to make a move against me?" Bumpy asked, letting the silence stretch. "You better make sure you're prepared for the consequences." With a sudden and swift motion, Bumpy threw the paper at O'Hara's feet, the paper fluttering down like a leaf in the wind. O'Hara bent down to pick it up, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. When he read the paper, his expression changed to one of disbelief. The letter was official, signed by powerful figures who had enough pull to make anyone in the NYPD step back. It was an ultimatum. The next move against Bumpy Johnson would come at a cost no one in law enforcement was willing to pay. The tension between them escalated to a breaking point, a moment where both men stood in silence, each sizing up the other, each knowing that a spark would set the city ablaze. "You're out of your league, O'Hara," Bumpy said, his voice steady but cold. "You think you own this city, but you're just a puppet, and I'm the one pulling the strings." O'Hara, realizing he had been outplayed, took one last drag of his cigarette, crushed it underfoot, and turned without a word. But as he walked back to his car, he knew Bumpy had just won. The game had shifted. For now, the streets belonged to Bumpy Johnson. The NYPD had just learned the hard way. Never underestimate the power of Harlem's king. Bumpy Johnson had always been a man of the streets. Born into the rough-and-tumble neighborhoods of Harlem, he grew up knowing one simple truth. Survival depended on power. Power in numbers, power in respect, power in fear. But more than anything, power in knowing how to control the game. The year was 1930, and Harlem had become a battleground, a place where anyone with ambition could carve out a piece of the pie, but only the strongest and the smartest would survive. In the midst of it all stood Bumpy, his reputation already solidified in the underworld. No one dared challenge him without consequences. His name had become synonymous with Harlem itself. Johnson was a force, a mythic figure who could change the course of events with a glance. In a city brimming with corruption and violence, where loyalty was bought and sold like commodities, Bumpy's control was unique. He wasn't just a criminal, a gangster. He was a force of nature. While others ran their operations with brute force, Bumpy ruled with strategy and intelligence. He understood the stakes better than anyone. Respect was currency, and in Harlem, it was the one thing that mattered above all. But this was the world Bumpy had been born into, a world that chewed up anyone who wasn't ready to fight for their piece of it. And he fought every day, rising from the depths of the criminal underworld, gaining influence through ruthless business deals and shrewd alliances. He was the man who had brokered peace between rival gangs, settled disputes with a well-placed word, and created an empire based on respect and fear. His empire wasn't built solely on the drug trade or rackets. It was built on his unparalleled ability to read people. He knew when to push, when to pull back, and when to strike. But even more important was his understanding of the city's power structures. In Harlem, that meant the balance between the local gangs, the corrupt politicians, and, most importantly, the police. The NYPD had always been a thorn in his side. Some cops were on the payroll, others tried to stand in his way, thinking they could dismantle his empire. But Bumpy had learned over the years that the best way to deal with the law was to outsmart them, make them think they were in control, while he pulled the strings from behind the curtain. It was a game of chess, and Bumpy was always 2 steps ahead. His rise to power had been marked by key moments, each one more significant than the last. By 1942, he had earned the respect of everyone, from the neighborhood hustlers to the high-ranking politicians. He controlled the streets, and with that control came influence, money, and most importantly, the kind of fear that made men think twice before crossing him. But it wasn't just about street smarts and street fights. Bumpy knew that in order to truly rule Harlem, he had to play the long game. He made alliances with men who had the resources and connections to help him cement his reign. He met with influential businessmen, politicians, and even mafiosos, all while keeping a foot in the street-level hustle that kept his power grounded in the people. By the time of the 1942 clash with the NYPD, Bumpy's name was spoken with reverence and fear. But even legends weren't immune to challenges. And when the police captain O'Hara, a corrupt officer with ambitions of his own, came for him, Bumpy knew it was time to show everyone just who was in charge. Harlem in 1942 was a city of contrasts, a place of immense wealth for some and abject poverty for others. Yet despite the challenges, Harlem had grown into something more than just a neighborhood. It had become an iconic symbol of black resilience, a place where the struggle for survival bred ingenuity and determination. It was a world in which men like Bumpy Johnson thrived, a world where power, respect, and loyalty were currency, and anyone who wanted a seat at the table had to earn it. But the streets weren't just ruled by men like Bumpy. There were other forces at play, forces that made even the most feared gangster think twice. The political power of Harlem's elites, the underhanded deals between politicians and the police, and the looming threat of rival gangs were all factors that constantly kept Bumpy on edge. In this high-stakes game, Bumpy had learned one crucial lesson. The law was both his greatest enemy and his greatest asset. He knew the police, like the rest of the system, could be manipulated. And so he played the game, always making sure he was in control of the narrative. He made deals with the right people, kept his enemies close, and never revealed his full hand. But O'Hara's challenge, this attempt to take Bumpy down, was different. It wasn't just a matter of rivalries or turf wars. It was personal. O'Hara had crossed the line, trying to dismantle Bumpy's operation and dethrone him from his place at the top. O'Hara, in his arrogance, thought that the law could overpower Bumpy's influence. But he didn't realize that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another man on the streets. He was the man who ran Harlem, and no one, not even the corrupt officials or the police, could take that from him without a fight. As the confrontation loomed closer, Bumpy prepared for the war that was about to unfold. But in the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't just about keeping his territory. It was about sending a message. The NYPD had picked the wrong fight. And on that night, when the tension would finally snap, Bumpy would show them just how wrong they were. As the days passed, the tension in Harlem thickened. The streets buzzed with rumors, and whispers of Bumpy Johnson's impending clash with the NYPD spread through the alleys like wildfire. It wasn't just the street-level hustlers who were on edge. The higher-ups, the politicians, and the business elites were all waiting to see how this battle would unfold. Bumpy's power was so entrenched, so absolute, that the repercussions of a conflict with the police could shake the very foundation of Harlem itself. But this wasn't just about turf. It was about pride. The NYPD had made a dangerous mistake by thinking they could intimidate Bumpy into submission. And O'Hara, the corrupt police captain who had waged this war, was about to learn that Bumpy wasn't a man to be pushed around. O'Hara, an ambitious and ruthless man, was no stranger to the criminal underworld. He had made his deals with the mob, turning a blind eye to their activities in exchange for kickbacks. But when Bumpy's operation started threatening the balance of power, when his influence reached into the political circles and even the highest echelons of the NYPD, O'Hara saw it as a personal affront. He wasn't going to let some street thug like Bumpy Johnson overshadow his authority, even if it meant going to war with one of the most feared men in the city. Bumpy had always known that his enemies would come for him eventually. The moment you reached the top, everyone wanted a piece of your power. But what O'Hara underestimated was Bumpy's ability to turn any situation into his favor. He had already seen the cracks in the NYPD's facade, the way the officers were bought and sold, the way the system turned a blind eye to corruption as long as it suited their interests. Bumpy understood this game, and he played it better than anyone. For days, Bumpy's men kept a close watch on O'Hara's movements. They knew the police captain's tactics, his methods of intimidation, and his attempts to infiltrate the underworld through bribery and force. O'Hara thought he had the upper hand, believing that the sheer weight of the NYPD's authority would crush Bumpy's operation. But Bumpy was no fool. He knew the game had changed. O'Hara had crossed a line, and now Bumpy would show him exactly what it meant to challenge the king of Harlem. On a cold evening in late November, the storm finally broke. Bumpy had been preparing for this moment, carefully orchestrating a strategy that would not only protect his turf, but send a message to the NYPD that no one, not even them, could control him. It was just after dusk when the first move was made. Bumpy and his trusted lieutenants gathered in a dimly lit room, smoke curling up from the cheap cigars they smoked, their faces etched with concentration. The room was filled with men who knew the streets better than anyone. Hardened veterans of the hustle, men who had earned their place in the dangerous world of organized crime. And now they were ready for war. Bumpy's lieutenant, a sharp-eyed man named Earl, had managed to get intel on O'Hara's plans. The police captain was making a bold move. He had ordered a raid on one of Bumpy's businesses, a warehouse that was used for laundering money and storing goods. The raid was set to go down that night, and Bumpy knew it was only a matter of time before O'Hara would make his move. But what O'Hara didn't know was that Bumpy had already anticipated the raid. He'd placed his own men inside the warehouse, ready to strike when the time came. Bumpy had learned long ago that knowledge was power. He wasn't going to let O'Hara take anything from him, not without a fight. As the clock struck midnight, the NYPD raid squad rolled up to the warehouse. Armed officers, led by O'Hara himself, stormed the building, ready to seize everything in sight. They believed they were making a decisive move, a show of force to prove they were in control. But as they breached the door, they found nothing but silence and the sharp stench of gunpowder in the air. Bumpy had set the trap perfectly. The warehouse was empty, save for a handful of Bumpy's men who had prepared for the inevitable confrontation. As soon as the police entered, they were met with a barrage of gunfire. O'Hara's men scrambled for cover, completely outmatched by Bumpy's crew. The police captain, his face twisted in shock and rage, called for reinforcements, but it was too late. In the chaos, Bumpy's men made their move. They were outnumbered, but they were smarter, quicker, and better prepared. Bumpy himself stayed in the shadows, overseeing everything from a safe distance, his eyes cold and calculating as his men executed the plan flawlessly. The confrontation quickly turned into a bloodbath. O'Hara, realizing he had been outplayed, ordered a retreat. But the damage was done. Bumpy's men had made their point. The NYPD had overstepped, and now they were paying the price. When the dust settled, several officers were injured, and a few were dead. O'Hara, humiliated and furious, fled the scene, swearing vengeance. But Bumpy knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over yet. The immediate aftermath of the raid sent shockwaves through Harlem. The police, for once, had been forced to retreat. The people of the neighborhood, who had long lived under the oppressive thumb of corrupt officers, watched as Bumpy Johnson emerged victorious. For them, this was more than just a win for a gangster. It was a sign that the streets could push back against the forces that had held them down for so long. Bumpy's reputation as a leader, a strategist, and a man who could outsmart even the most powerful institutions in New York only grew stronger. He had proven once again that no one could touch him, especially not the police. The following days in Harlem were filled with whispers of the daring confrontation at the warehouse. Bumpy Johnson's name was on everyone's lips, and the stories of his triumph echoed through the streets. The police, bruised and humiliated, were scrambling to regain control of the situation, but they had made a grave miscalculation, underestimating the power of a man who knew the system better than they ever would. Bumpy, ever the strategist, knew the NYPD wouldn't back down quietly. He understood that O'Hara and his ilk would eventually come looking for revenge. But Bumpy had always been a step ahead, and this time he would use their desperation against them. He wasn't just fighting for his empire, he was fighting for the respect and authority he'd earned, a respect that would not be easily taken away. As the days passed, tensions between Bumpy's operation and the NYPD reached a boiling point. It wasn't just O'Hara now, the whole police department was eager to settle the score. There were murmurs of a crackdown, a full-scale effort to take down Bumpy's crew once and for all. But the thing that most didn't realize was that Bumpy wasn't some small-time hustler. He wasn't even just the king of Harlem. He was a force of nature. He knew the streets better than anyone, and his power was rooted in more than just violence. It was in the respect he commanded, the alliances he'd forged, and the way he could turn the tables on anyone who tried to cross him. The final confrontation came on a humid July night, the kind of night where everything felt on the edge of chaos. Bumpy had received word that O'Hara was planning one last raid to crush his operation once and for all. This time, they weren't going to settle for a few bruised egos. The NYPD was coming in with everything they had. Guns blazing, ready to take down Bumpy and his crew. Bumpy knew the raid was coming, and he had prepared for it like a chess player lining up his pieces. He'd used his network of informants to track every move the police made. He knew O'Hara was planning to hit one of his most lucrative operations, a speakeasy that had become a front for his more profitable business dealings. The speakeasy was a gold mine, and it was guarded like a fortress. Bumpy had set up the perfect trap. He had baited O'Hara into believing they had the upper hand. But Bumpy was always the one pulling the strings. As the first wave of police arrived, they found the building eerily quiet. No sounds of movement, no sign of activity, but what they didn't know was that Bumpy's men were already in place, hidden, waiting. The moment the police breached the door, a hail of gunfire erupted. Officers scrambled for cover, realizing too late that they had walked straight into a well-laid ambush. The room exploded with the sounds of gunshots and shouting, chaos unraveling as Bumpy's crew, armed and prepared, tore through the police ranks like a well-oiled machine. Bumpy was everywhere and nowhere. He wasn't in the thick of the fight, but his presence was felt at every corner of the battle. He'd set the trap, and now he watched as O'Hara's men scrambled to respond to the unexpected attack. Bumpy's crew moved with precision, picking off officers, forcing them into retreat. It was a battle of wills now. O'Hara's men were scrambling, and Bumpy's crew was in control. Amidst the chaos, Bumpy's eyes stayed locked on his target, O'Hara himself. The police captain had been spotted earlier, leading the charge from the front, but he was now nowhere to be found. Bumpy knew O'Hara wouldn't go down easily. The police captain was a man of pride, someone who wouldn't allow himself to be shown up by a gangster. But Bumpy knew the truth. O'Hara had already lost the battle before it even began. The moment he ordered that raid, it had become personal. And now, Bumpy was about to make him pay. It wasn't long before the final confrontation came. Bumpy had anticipated every move, and he knew O'Hara would try to make a last-ditch effort to regain control. As the police captain reappeared, gun in hand, ready to make one final push, Bumpy stepped out from the shadows. The two men stood there, facing each other, the weight of their animosity palpable. "You think you can just walk into my city, O'Hara?" Bumpy's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You think you can take everything I've worked for without paying the price?" O'Hara, face red with anger, sneered, raising his gun. "You're nothing but a thug, Johnson. You've always been a thug. This ends tonight." But Bumpy wasn't fazed. He'd been in situations like this before, outnumbered, cornered, but never defeated. He was a man who knew how to make his enemies come to him. And tonight, the NYPD was about to learn the cost of challenging him. The tension between them was unbearable, but in that moment, it was clear who held the power. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't flinch. O'Hara was the one who hesitated, and in that split second, Bumpy made his move. The crack of gunfire rang out as O'Hara fell to the ground, a victim of his own arrogance. As the police captain crumpled to the floor, the remaining officers, stunned by the sudden turn of events, were left with no choice but to retreat. Bumpy's men had them pinned down, outgunned and outmatched. O'Hara's attempt to crush Bumpy's empire had failed, and now the consequences were clear. The aftermath of the battle was swift. The NYPD was left with their tails between their legs, nursing their wounds and trying to salvage what was left of their pride. Harlem, on the other hand, had witnessed something extraordinary. The streets that had long been under the shadow of police corruption and violence had just seen a man stand up to the system and win. In the days that followed, Harlem buzzed with a mixture of shock, awe, and approval. The aftermath of the raid and its shocking conclusion spread like wildfire through the streets. News of Bumpy Johnson's victory over the NYPD reached every corner of the city. The legendary gangster had once again shown that he wasn't just a man to be feared, but a man who commanded respect. And the NYPD? They had been humiliated. their pride shattered in front of the very community they had once tried to control with an iron fist. As word spread, there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of Harlem. For years, the residents had lived under the thumb of the police. Corruption and brutality were commonplace. But now, they saw something different. They saw Bumpy Johnson, a man who was willing to stand up not just for himself, but for the community that had long been pushed to the edge. He had fought back, and he had won. The news of O'Hara's defeat spread across the city like a storm. The police, despite their attempts to save face, were left with the reality that their plan had backfired spectacularly. They had underestimated Bumpy, and it cost them dearly. O'Hara's loss was not just a personal defeat. It was a public one that sent a powerful message to everyone who had ever doubted Bumpy's ability to dominate Harlem. But in the midst of this victory, Bumpy remained as cold and calculating as ever. The fight wasn't over. He knew that while the NYPD had been sent packing, the establishment wouldn't simply forget the damage done to their reputation. The battle between him and the city's power structures was far from finished. But for now, Harlem was his, and no one could dispute that. As he walked through the streets in the aftermath, Bumpy's presence was a silent declaration of dominance. The shopkeepers, the street vendors, the people who had always feared the law, they all knew who controlled Harlem now. Bumpy's victory was more than just about taking down a few corrupt cops. It was about sending a message that no one, not even the powerful police forces of New York, could simply come into Harlem and impose their will. This was Bumpy's city. In the weeks that followed, Bumpy's crew strengthened their hold on the streets. The remaining police officers were too cautious to venture into Harlem with the same authority they once had. They kept their distance, watching from afar, knowing that their defeat at the hands of Bumpy Johnson had left them with little more than a fractured reputation. Bumpy, however, was all too aware of the transient nature of power. He knew that there would be others who would rise to challenge him, who would test his resolve. But for now, he was the king of Harlem, and no one dared to take that throne from him. As the days turned into weeks, Bumpy's reputation grew even stronger. His name became synonymous with not just the criminal world, but with the fight for justice in Harlem. The people who had once looked to the police for protection now saw Bumpy as their protector. They spoke of him with reverence, as if his very presence was a shield that kept the forces of oppression at bay. The streets, once filled with the tension of constant fear, now carried an air of defiance. Bumpy had shown them that they could fight back and win, but Bumpy was no fool. He knew that the NYPD would eventually regroup, that the system would try to restore its control over Harlem. He understood that power was never permanent and that the fight for justice was ongoing. But in the short term, he had proven that he was a force to be reckoned with, and that was enough. For now, the consequences of his victory were clear. The NYPD had been humiliated, and Bumpy's grip on Harlem was tighter than ever. But in the back of his mind, he knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The powers that be would never fully accept his dominance, and they would come for him again. But Bumpy Johnson had never been one to back down from a fight. He had earned his place in Harlem, and he would defend it with everything he had. In the months that followed the battle with the NYPD, Bumpy Johnson's reputation reached new heights. The streets of Harlem, once ruled by fear and distrust, were now under the control of a man who had shown that even the most powerful institutions could be brought to their knees. Bumpy was not just the leader of a criminal empire. He was a symbol of resistance, a figure who had stood up to the corrupt systems that had long oppressed his people. For Harlem's residents, Bumpy was more than just a gangster. He had become a folk hero, someone who had taken on the full force of the establishment and emerged victorious. He wasn't just fighting for money or power, he was fighting for respect. And in the eyes of the people, he had earned it. The NYPD had been forced to retreat, and for the first time in years, the streets of Harlem felt like they belonged to the people who had lived there all along. But Bumpy's victory didn't come without its costs. The power structures that controlled the city weren't going to forget the humiliation they had suffered. They would regroup, strategize, and find new ways to take back control. But Bumpy wasn't a man who could be so easily defeated. He had proven that he was untouchable, a man who understood the streets and the systems that controlled them better than anyone. He knew how to manipulate the power dynamics, how to use the city's politics against itself. Bumpy Johnson was a force of nature, and he had made his mark on Harlem in a way that would never be erased. His name became synonymous with power, and the respect he commanded wasn't just from his allies, it came from the very institutions that had once sought to crush him. The police may have regrouped, but they did so with a healthy dose of fear in their hearts. They knew that challenging Bumpy Johnson wasn't just about confronting a man, it was about confronting the will of a community that had risen up and fought back. As time went on, Bumpy's influence continued to grow. He wasn't just the king of Harlem, he was the king of a movement that sought to bring justice to the streets and to show that the people had the power to change their circumstances. He had become the embodiment of resistance, the figure who had taken on the system and made it bow to his will. Bumpy Johnson had become a legend, not just in Harlem, but in the hearts and minds of those who believed in the power of standing up to oppression. Bumpy Johnson's name echoed through Harlem and, by extension, the city of New York. His fight against the police had become a defining moment, not just for his life, but for the lives of countless others who had lived under the oppressive thumb of law enforcement for too long. His victory was more than just a personal triumph. It was a symbol of what could happen when the people refused to be silenced, when they found the courage to fight back against those who sought to control them. The people of Harlem, the ones who had once lived in fear of the police, now stood taller. They walked the streets with their heads held high, knowing that the man who had given them their dignity back was Bumpy Johnson. His influence had spread far beyond the streets. He had become the face of a new kind of resistance, not the kind that relied on weapons or force, but the kind that fought with strategy, resilience, and an unyielding will. In the years that followed, Bumpy's legend only grew. The city would change, and the power structures would adapt. But the memory of that night, the night Bumpy Johnson stood alone against the NYPD and emerged victorious, would never fade. It was a moment in history that couldn't be erased, a moment that changed Harlem forever. But for Bumpy, the fight was never over. He knew that power was fleeting, that nothing lasts forever in the world he inhabited. Yet he had carved out a place for himself, and in doing so, he had cemented his place in history. He had proven that one man, no matter how humble or feared, could stand against the tide and change the course of a community. In the end, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just remembered for the empire he built or the wars he fought. He was remembered for the way he fought for the dignity of those who had been overlooked and cast aside. For the people of Harlem, Bumpy wasn't just a king, he was their champion. His struggle, his battle against the NYPD, had turned him into a symbol of resistance, a hero in a community that had long been ignored. This wasn't just about one man's pride or his thirst for power. This was about the pride of a community, the fight for justice, and the relentless pursuit of respect. The people of Harlem had learned a valuable lesson that night. When you stand together, when you refuse to bow down, you can change the world. And sometimes, it takes a legend to show you how. Bumpy Johnson's legacy wasn't just built on the streets or the turf he controlled. It was built on the lives he touched, the people he protected, and the change he inspired. And as the years went by, his name would continue to echo in the hearts of those who knew that their victory, no matter how small, was made possible by the courage of a man who refused to let them be forgotten.